George Orwell's 1984 has long since become a literary fixture of the English-speaking world. It's a distillation of the totalitarian systems of the early 20th century that captures the essence of how they function and their ultimate aim of power for its own sake and self-perpetuation. Terms like Orwellian, Big Brother, doublethink, and thought police are frequently used in our political discourse, with people across the spectrum frequently accusing their opponents of using 1984 as an instruction manual. The central element of the book is that the essence of control doesn't come from police and prisons, but rather the control of ideas. From Winston Smith falsifying records in the Ministry of Truth to the ever-shrinking Newspeak dictionary, it's a story about the malleability of thought, about how it can be shaped by words, by pain, and how the manipulation of thought is entwined with the destruction of language as a value-neutral method of communication, instead transforming it into a vehicle of indoctrination and control. 1984 illustrates a system of power that pops the hood on much of the modern world and lets us see how it runs, even if the real-world equivalents are much less overt. The telescreen, for example, which not only displays government propaganda and can't be turned off, but is also an instrument of surveillance, watching everyone in its field of view. It's a blunter, cruder representation of what we actually have, a public-private partnership providing a constant media stew parroting establishment-approved narratives while collecting vast amounts of data on what we watch, where we go, and who we associate with. But while the face of Big Brother staring out from a telescreen is one of the book's iconic elements, the system it depicts goes much deeper than a surveillance and censorship apparatus. For most of human history, crime has been defined by action, something a person does. It's long since expanded into crimes of possession, having prohibited drugs or weapons, things of that sort. And of course, under repressive regimes, the possession of subversive material is criminalized, whether works of literature critical of the regime or overtly political material. Criminalizing the expression of those ideas naturally follows. But Orwell takes it to the next logical step, with merely thinking a prohibited idea itself being a crime. Under Ingsoc, obedience is not enough.
It's not enough to obey him. You must love him.
This requires people to have a mental discipline that is both highly selective and automatic. Doublethink, the ability to hold contradictory ideas without cognitive dissonance. But doublethink isn't merely contradiction. For example, a gun-banning politician with armed private security isn't doublethink, it's just elitist hypocrisy. Doublethink entails a certainty in and a devotion to mutually exclusive ideas. And it's across the spectrum of American politics. Two examples. To simultaneously believe that the United States should put America first and that the United States must always stand with Israel requires doublethink because the two things are often not aligned. As another example, there's trans women are women, but trans is also a distinct identity whose rights must be protected. They are and are not simultaneously. In both cases, I'm speaking of the macro-level manipulation of thought and language, the conceptual level rather than the granular level of individual people, which is a distinction that has to be plainly stated because the usual response to those observations is itself an example of the manipulation of language to constrain thought to a narrow path. If you question any aspect of trans activism or criticize the actions of the Israeli state, you're labeled as transphobic or anti-Semitic. That knee-jerk blanket condemnation prevents nuanced consideration and allows both contradictory positions to continue coexisting in the mind. Even those terms, transphobe and anti-Semite, are themselves a bit peculiar when you break them down. There's a whole iceberg of deliberately crafted political language happening that corrals people towards certain conclusions, squeezing out any contextual variability and leaving only predetermined, politically charged positions to react against. It removes the need to think. The automatization of argument. This can be done partly through overt propaganda, often demonizing or dehumanizing the opponent while deifying one's own cause. God is on our side against the murderous Hun, in so many words. It can be as simple as keeping it positive. Pro-life versus pro-choice, for example. Neither side identifies as anti-something. It sounds too aggressive and negative. We have terms like hate speech, which is designed to sound indefensible, and once established can be expanded to encompass other things the powers that be want to put off limits to discussion. Immigration policy, for example. But it can also take the form of an interlocking framework of ideas and terminology. Marxism and fascism are notorious for formulating ideas that mean the opposite of what they say. Fascism reasserts the rights of the state as expressing the real essence of the individual. The first act by virtue of which the state really constitutes itself the representative of the whole of society, the taking possession of the means of production in the name of society, this is, at the same time, its last independent act as a state. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things, and by the conduct of processes of production. The state is not abolished, it withers away. True individualism is subordination to the group. Government will be replaced by an administration of things. We'll touch on that later. The party slogans distill this contradictory nature down to its essence. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. But while modern political movements introduce their own terminology to shape the narratives, whether it's framing everything in terms of Nazi racial hierarchies, Marxist class struggle, modern identity politics, it functions to dehumanize individuals as merely pieces of a model. The bourgeoisie is always at odds with the proletariat. Cis-white males are the natural enemy of BIPOCs. The wording changes, but the nonsense, that's always the same. Newspeak takes it to another level. Because the party is quintessentially totalitarian, it's compelled to control not just specialized ideological language, but language itself. Newspeak is a universal mechanism of societal-level censorship. Try posting a mean tweet when you don't have the words. Big Brother is double plus ungood isn't going to fire up the spirit of resistance. By narrowing the scope of language, you limit not only what the people can talk about, but what they can think about. It's in some ways an automation of thought.
Language coming from here, not from here.
Which actually has a Soviet-era precedent. During the 1920s, when Stalin accelerated the massive Soviet industrialization push, Alexei Gastev was I don't even know what to call him, a labor theorist and poet, I suppose. He was head of the Central Institute of Labor and did a lot of work building on and refining Frederick Taylor's ideas on scientific management, which had been used to greatly increase productivity at the Ford Motor Company. Gastev worked to optimize motion of the human body and arrange work areas to maximize efficiency. Carry out the mechanization of man himself. The perfect mastery of a given movement implies maximum automatization. And he wanted to do the same thing with the Russian language in the name of efficiency, eliminating flowery or meandering sentences and unnecessary words and phrases. And while this attempt at streamlining Russian never got past the stage of one of Gastev's eccentricities, it's not a huge leap to imagine that such an effort to make the language more efficient would quickly also turn toward making it more Marxist-Leninist, inherently favoring that ideology. That's where Newspeak fits, not only by stripping the language down in the interest of efficiency.
It's that thick. The 11th edition will be that thick.
But also laying out a map for permissible thoughts. A map that dead ends all the thought crime before it can fully form into ideas expressible by language.
The whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought.
To narrow the range of thought?
In the end, we'll make thought crime literally impossible because there'll be no words to express it.
And when you combine Newspeak-type molding of language with doublethink, you can make people believe absurdities, and switch to new absurdities without missing a beat. The book gives us a great dramatization of this with Hate Week, a national festival of rage against Eurasia with whom Oceania is at war. It's like a cross between a Nazi rally and a Maoist struggle session, and Hate Week culminates with the execution of thousands of Eurasian prisoners. But there's a little hiccup. The speech had been proceeding for perhaps 20 minutes when a messenger hurried onto the platform and a scrap of paper was slipped into the speaker's hand. He unrolled and read it without pausing in his speech. Nothing altered in his voice or manner or in the content of what he was saying, but suddenly the names were different. Without words said, a wave of understanding rippled through the crowd. Oceania was at war with East Asia. The next moment there was a tremendous commotion. The banners and posters with which the square was decorated were all wrong. Quite half of them had the wrong faces on them. It was sabotage. The agents of Goldstein had been at work. There was a riotous interlude while posters were ripped from the walls, banners torn to shreds and trampled underfoot. The spies performed prodigies of activity in clambering over the rooftops and cutting the streamers that fluttered from the chimneys. But within 2 or 3 minutes, it was all over. The orator, still gripping the neck of the microphone, his shoulders hunched forward, his free hand clawing at the air, had gone straight on with his speech. 1 minute more and the feral roars of rage were again bursting from the crowd. The hate continued exactly as before, except that the target had been changed. This is only slightly more sudden than changes in narrative we can see in our own news media. As I record this, it's early August 2024, and until a few weeks ago, the nearly universal media refrain was that Joe Biden was sharp as a tack.
He's fine. All this right-wing propaganda that his mental acuity has declined is wrong.
Anyone suggesting that he was in mental decline was a crazy conspiracy theorist. Right up until the moment his party pushed him out over his mental decline. It takes a little longer, days rather than minutes, to completely flip the script, but it's the same mechanism, relying partly on social coercion, but mostly on immersion and programming to take cues on what the appropriate belief is at any given time. Now, today, refusing to accept crazy nonsense doesn't in itself get you hauled off to Room 101. Mostly it just gets you trolled. But it's still the pressures of ideological conditioning, which includes not only seeing political opponents as not merely disagreeing, but as less than human or morally flawed in some way. And when those alignments become part of your self-perception, I'm a liberal Democrat because I care about people, or I'm a conservative Republican because I believe in freedom, and your opponents are by definition against those things, then you can't be objective because the cost of objectivity is too high. It entails an abandonment of virtue. Add to that social pressures and workplace consequences sometimes, and most people follow the party line. Consider the rollout of Big Pharma's special sauce in 2020, a combination of narrative creation, workplace carrot and stick measures, and social shaming. People weren't physically forced to comply, but there was a clear, socially correct answer. Or look to China, where their social credit system is more blunt, but operating on the same basic principle. Do what you should as defined by the power structure, or things will get more difficult for you. Those examples are somewhere between a bothersome nag society and the utter nightmare of Oceania under Ingsoc. Because Oceania isn't just a totalitarian state, it's a permanent, centrally planned war economy. The party has two objects of hate, whoever they're at war with on any given day, and Emmanuel Goldstein, who serves as a symbol for all the world's evils. Goldstein is a sort of Trotsky figure, very important to the rise of Ingsoc, but recast as the arch-traitor.
I was one of the leaders of that revolution, so who should know better the ideals for which we fought?
When our narrator, I won't say hero because Winston Smith is not heroic, when he's brought into the alleged resistance, the Brotherhood, he's given a book to read, Goldstein's book. The Theory and Practice of Oligarchal Collectivism. At least, that's one story. The lack of reliable narration is part of the point. Goldstein lays out the workings of a permanent state of war propping up the three major powers, Oceania, Eurasia, and East Asia. They're evenly matched, and none of them actually want to risk a major defeat in an attempt to disrupt the fundamental balance. All three societies are propped up by their ongoing war with the others, a war that can never be decisively won or lost. Sustainable warfare. In one combination or another, these three superstates are permanently at war, and have been so for the past 25 years. War, however, is no longer the desperate, annihilating struggle that it was in the early decades of the 20th century. It is a warfare of limited aims between combatants who are unable to destroy one another, have no material cause for fighting, and are not divided by any genuine ideological difference. It's war as the basis for social and economic stability. War is peace. It's a war that is fought on the periphery, but consumes enough to keep industry producing. People work factories and mines, the nation produces goods, but nothing that actually feeds into the consumer economy. It's all about the war. The primary aim of modern warfare, in accordance with the principles of doublethink, this aim is simultaneously recognized and not recognized by the directing brains of the inner party, is to use up the products of the machine without raising the general standard of living. Goldstein theorized that if the standard of living were to rise, if the working classes worked shorter hours for better pay and had more leisure time, then not only would the hierarchy of wealth break down, but they would determine that the hierarchy of power was superfluous and sweep it away. and the party wants to maintain power now that they've taken it. The problem was how to keep the wheels of industry turning without increasing the real wealth of the world. Goods must be produced, but they must not be distributed. And in practice, the only way of achieving this was by continuous warfare. Put another way, the military-industrial complex is a mechanism for maintaining the existing power structure through contained wars fought far from the mainland, wars that can't be lost but also can't really be won while consuming steady supplies of manufactured equipment. And while I could just as easily be describing the war on terror in that statement, Oceania's forever war relies on a near-complete stagnation in science and technology. Obviously, that isn't the case in our own system. Technology is constantly advancing in warfighting and everything else. And yet, it is curious that some of those advances in the military sphere have served to take us back to older forms of war. Even 10 years ago, the idea that we'd ever see another European war with trench fighting and mass assaults on fortified positions would have seemed silly. And yet, Ukraine is showing us that with cheap drones and theater-wide real-time intelligence gathering, the battlefield has been leveled, at least partially. Maneuver warfare of the type made famous by the German mechanized forces of World War II and refined by the US military ever since doesn't really work that well when an opponent can watch you with relatively cheap drones and prepare a counter before you finish massing for an advance. Those same drones can severely hinder the combat utility of tanks, delivering incapacitating hits by remote control, and man-portable anti-aircraft missiles make complete air superiority in a battle space a thing of the past. Ukraine's recent mechanized push into Kursk may prove to be a counterpoint, but more likely will end up cut off and ground down, supporting the case that rapid drives into enemy territory can't deliver decisive gains under current conditions. It's not a permanent shift, of course. The history of war is a history of adapting. The tank isn't dead, but new designs will have to account for attacks from above. Tactics will change to deal with the new conditions. But for the moment, how we fight wars appears to be moving backwards. And while the three-power sustainable war described in 1984 is far simpler than the current global situation, there are parallels. Today, we can see Russia holding back from utterly destroying Ukraine, as they absolutely could, while the NATO bloc feeds in enough ammo and equipment to keep the war going, but offering no real chance of decisive victory. Meanwhile, the Russian defense industry has gotten a boost, while the West has been able to unload old equipment while simultaneously creating a need for new production to replace the old stock of munitions. Both sides continue to be at war in Eurasia, with no end in sight. Emmanuel Goldstein is presented in different ways throughout the book. He's first referenced in the daily 2 Minutes Hate, where he's presented as the arch-traitor, Ingsock's own devil. Later, he's the founder of the Brotherhood, the resistance group fighting in the shadows to overthrow the tyranny of the party. And of course, Goldstein is a vehicle through which Orwell explains the party's structure and governing mechanism as a metaphor for trends visible in the time he was writing. At no point is Goldstein presented as a good guy. His book lays out all the ways in which the party manipulates and oppresses the people, but not in a fiery condemnation, but rather analytically as one of its theorists. Assuming, of course, that Goldstein wrote it at all. O'Brien, Winston's inner-party captor, tells a different story.
I wrote it. Or at least I collaborated in writing it. No book is individually produced, as you know.
O'Brien is hardly a reliable source, and whether the book was written by a committee as a lure for subversives or actually written by Goldstein, betrayer of the party and merely repurposed as a convenient heresy, is immaterial. It's what Orwell is trying to tell us with it that matters. Orwell, Eric Blair, is claimed by just about everyone with any hint of a dissident stripe, usually with some gross oversimplification and assuming that the man was consistent. The relevant point here is that while he described himself as a socialist, he was vehemently opposed to Stalinism and its knockoffs. He's not anti-socialism, but anti-authoritarian socialism. And based on that, I think we have to consider that not only is Ingsock, English socialism, a grim satire of the Soviet system, but that Goldstein is a sort of satirical alt-Marx. Like Marx, Goldstein asserts a class-based model of history. Throughout recorded time, and probably since the end of the Neolithic Age, there have been three kinds of people in the world: the high, the middle, and the low. Even after enormous upheavals and seemingly irrevocable changes, the same pattern has always reasserted itself, just as a gyroscope will always return to equilibrium, however far it is pushed one way or the other. From this, he posits a natural and perpetual class struggle. He makes a philosophical argument, but frames it in a deterministic, quasi-scientific way. Then, having established by assertion these classes and their struggle as a fundamental rule, he proposes a mechanism to stop the cycle, asserting it will result in an end-of-history equilibrium that can continue unchanged indefinitely. The Marxism metaphor is made more bluntly through O'Brien. The German Nazis and the Russian communists came very close to us in their methods, but they never had the courage to recognize their own motives. They pretended, perhaps they even believed, that they had seized power unwillingly and for a limited time, and that just around the corner there lay a paradise where human beings would be free and equal. We are not like that. We know that no one ever seizes power with the intention of relinquishing it. Power is not a means, it is an end. One does not establish a dictatorship in order to safeguard a revolution. One makes the revolution in order to establish the dictatorship. The object of persecution is persecution. The object of torture is torture. The object of power is power. Now do you begin to understand me? Notably, Goldstein and O'Brien are in agreement on how the party works, how it maintains power through control of thought and perpetual war. Only Goldstein's later counter-revolutionary claims are rejected. Is it true what it says? As description, yes. The program it sets forth is nonsense. Goldstein's book is a scathing takedown of Marxism, Stalinism, state socialism, whatever you want to call the state seizing the means of production and ruling in the name of the people. The title gives it away. Oligarchal Collectivism is the concentrating of wealth by the state into collective property owned by the state, but managed by a small group of people. People who live in the best houses, get the best food, live more comfortably than the vast bulk of the population, but they don't actually own any of it, so it's still collectivism. The oligarchs might seem rich and powerful, but they're really just servants of the people, you see. That twisting of language again. Bringing us back to the beginning, with Winston Smith toiling at his desk in the Ministry of Truth, where he edits old newspapers and other records to reflect the narrative of the day. A fact-checker of sorts. The party decrees something is no longer true, and he makes sure the old records are brought in line. The past is constantly altered by falsifying records, and doublethink allows the people to internalize the new story and forget the old.
As announced in our last bulletin, there has been a change in the chocolate ration. An increase to 20 grams a week.
Increase?
Hear that, isn't it wonderful? Oh, my kids will be pleased.
The chocolate ration was reduced to 20 grams only yesterday. Yes, they believe it. Doublethink. They make themselves believe it.
Been there. Winston is part of the process.
Rutherford unperson. Substitute Ogilvy.
He slaps together an old newspaper article to replace one about an unpersoned inner party member with some new story about an invented war hero, then tosses the old record into the memory hole. But Winston isn't great at keeping his mind in order. He remembers things. He even kept a photo once. It's inevitable that he'll be caught by the thought police. He's an easy mark for O'Brien's FBI-style recruiting into a fake revolutionary group and getting him to agree to commit terrorist acts against the party.
You're prepared to commit murder?
Yes.
To betray your country to a foreign power?
Yes.
Yet for all his willingness to pledge this, his willingness to take risks to meet O'Brien to discuss revolt, to meet his lover Julia, to plot the overthrow of the party, when the moment comes, his defiance evaporates.
Clasp your hands behind your heads.
To run for life, to get out of the house before it was too late. No such thought occurred to them. Unthinkable to disobey the iron voice from the wall. Cultural conditioning is a powerful thing. Knowing they're going to be taken to certain death, they still fear the consequences of disobedience. And while languishing in the holding cell, Winston meets two of his colleagues who have also run afoul of the party.
Thought crime is so insidious. It just creeps up on you.
And this is the final piece of how the system works. It needs constant threats, not serious ones, nothing genuinely dangerous to the system, but something to keep the fear and the hate alive. The heretic, the enemy of society, will always be there so that he can be defeated and humiliated over again. It needs these conspiring enemies lurking in the dark corners of the world, whether or not a real threat actually exists. Modern politics manifests this in a lot of ways. The big bipartisan monster, of course, is the quarter-century of anti-terrorism. We're scanned, prodded, and groped at airports. Phones are tracked, online activity scraped and logged. Cameras are everywhere, all in the name of protecting us from terrorists. And yet the FBI has to manufacture terrorist plots so they have something to stop. But it's all as fake as anything Winston Smith dreamed up to fill a blank column of old newsprint. 1984 is about that process of making people believe lies. At first, it's the passive lies, using manufactured fear of phantom enemies to cloud reason in a relentless hammering away at the mind. The last third of the book is a step-by-step process of breaking down Winston's individuality through physical pain mixed with the humiliation of a struggle session. And when he's broken, he's given new definitions and new models through which to see the world. He has the same words, but they mean different things. 2 + 2 is still 4, except when it's 5 or 3. It's a reflection of what all totalitarian ideologies try to do and how people living under them survive. Parrot the lies long enough and some part of you starts to believe them. But it doesn't have to be electric shock torture in a dungeon. 1984, this distinctly mid-20th century dystopian vision, remains relevant not because it's a warning of the world we're heading toward or a description of the one we live in. It's not an instruction manual. At best, it's an outdated guidebook showing us streets that are unrecognizable, but with a few landmarks in the same place. It's a fable about how intelligent people can believe absurdities, about how a conditioned malleability of mind and language can make anything appear self-evident, even the impossible. Of course, not every contorted turn of phrase or nonsensical doctrine is a sign of latent totalitarianism waiting to snatch power and build labor camps. But the manipulation of language does reveal blind spots where the abuse of power can take root. It's a reminder that we all engage in some level of doublethink, resort to some degree of newspeak, and that we can be blinded by our old Goldsteining of people we think we're not supposed to agree with, especially when we do agree on some particular point. I'll leave with this from the book's appendix. Crime stop means the faculty of stopping short as though by instinct at the threshold of any dangerous thought. It includes the power of not grasping analogies, of failing to perceive logical errors, of misunderstanding the simplest arguments if they are inimical to ingsoc. Take a bite out of thought crime!